He controlled billions. He controlled fear. He controlled an empire built on silence and blood. But every night at exactly 7:43 p.m., his pregnant wife picked up a battered blue thermos and walked out the door. And Kang Min-jae, the most feared Korean mafia boss in the Pacific Northwest, couldn't stop her, couldn't follow her, couldn't even ask her where she was going without watching something close behind her eyes. For 11 nights, he let it go. On the 12th night, he couldn't anymore. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Follow the channel so you don't miss a single part, because what Min-jae discovers at the end of that rainy street is going to change everything you think you know about power, love, and what a man is truly capable of protecting. The rain had been falling since noon. By 7 p.m., it was no longer falling. It was pressing. Heavy, cold, and relentless, the way Pacific Northwest rain always turned in October. Like the sky had made up its mind about something and wasn't interested in discussion. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the 43rd floor penthouse ran with water in long diagonal streaks, and from where Kang Min-jae stood, Seattle looked like a city dissolving into its own reflection. He had a glass of scotch in his hand that he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. He was watching the elevator doors. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the Harrow building, a tower that Min-jae's holding company had purchased 7 years ago through 4 layers of shell corporations and one very accommodating city councilman who no longer served on the zoning board for reasons that had never been formally investigated. The interior had been redesigned twice. White marble floors, recessed lighting that could be adjusted to 14 different temperatures of warmth, a kitchen that a 3-star chef had helped spec out, even though Min-jae ate most of his meals standing over the counter reading documents, custom furniture, a master suite with a view of Elliott Bay that real estate developers paid photographers thousands of dollars to capture, and which Min-jae never looked at because the view faced east and the port was west, and the port was where his money moved. It was a beautiful apartment the way a well-maintained weapon was beautiful, functional, expensive, designed to project a particular kind of power. Serena had added a reading chair near the south window, overstuffed, slightly mismatched with everything else, upholstered in a faded green fabric that she'd had shipped from a second-hand furniture warehouse in Tacoma. The first time Min-jae saw it, he'd stared at it for a long moment without speaking, trying to understand what it was doing in a room where everything else had been chosen with deliberate precision. Serena had watched him from the kitchen doorway and said, "I like it." Not defensively, not as an explanation, just as a fact that she had decided was sufficient. He hadn't said anything. The chair was still there. So was the thermos. It was sitting on the entryway table right now, where she always left it before going to change after dinner. A 32-ounce Stanley knockoff in a blue that had once been bright and was now the particular faded shade that only comes from years of actual use. The rubber grip around the middle was worn smooth in 2 places where her fingers naturally fell. The lid had a small dent on the left side. One of the stickers that had once decorated it, he could tell there had been stickers once, from the ghost outlines of adhesive residue, had been removed so completely and carefully that he suspected she had done it with something precise, a razor blade or a fingernail worked with deliberate patience. He had looked at that thermos more times than he could count over the past 3 weeks. He had never asked about it. This was, he recognized, its own kind of information. Kang Min-jae had not built his organization by avoiding uncomfortable questions. He had built it by asking questions that other people were too frightened to ask, and then listening very carefully to the answers, and then making decisions based on what people revealed in the spaces between their words. He had a talent for it, for reading the architecture of what was not being said. His underboss, a compact, gray-templed man named Dae-sung, who had known Min-jae since they were both running package deliveries for a protection outfit in the Belltown district 17 years ago, had once told a story at a dinner that Min-jae had not been meant to overhear, that being questioned by Min-jae felt like being slowly disassembled, bolt by bolt, until you were standing in a pile of your own components, trying to remember what shape you had originally been. Min-jae had heard this and felt something that was almost satisfaction. He was 39 years old. He stood 6 feet, which was tall for a Korean man of his generation, with the kind of build that suggested he had once been stronger and was still not someone to underestimate. Wide through the shoulders, carrying a very slight softening at the jaw that came from years of good food and better scotch, but with hands that were still thick and quick. He kept his black hair cut short and slightly longer on top, pushed back without product in a way that looked careless and wasn't. His face was angular and composed in a way that people frequently misread as coldness. It wasn't coldness exactly. It was the expression of a man who had learned early that visible emotion was a liability and had practiced its concealment until the practice became the thing itself. There was a scar along his left forearm, pale and slightly raised, 7 inches long, from a confrontation in a shipping warehouse in 2019 that had been resolved decisively and was not discussed. He was, by every operational measure, a man in complete control of his environment. He heard Serena's footsteps on the marble hallway. She walked heavier now, 6 months along, her center of gravity shifting in ways that were new to both of them. And he moved away from the window. He picked up the scotch and took a sip he didn't want, turning toward the kitchen so that when she appeared in the entryway, he would be doing something instead of standing there watching the elevator. She was wearing a dark green maternity jacket over a gray wool sweater, and she'd pulled her hair back in a low knot that she always did when she was leaving the apartment in weather. Brown leather boots with flat soles. She'd switched to flat soles 2 months ago without making anything of it, just quietly retired the heeled ankle boots she'd been wearing and replaced them. And he'd noticed but hadn't said that either. She had the thermos in her left hand. She was 31. She was not classically beautiful the way people in his world sometimes expected a man like him to have acquired, as though a wife were another asset to be optimized. She was something better than that. She had a quality of presence that Min-jae had noticed the first time he saw her at a gallery opening that he'd attended for strategic reasons and left for entirely different ones. Something steady in the way she occupied space. An attentiveness to what was actually in front of her rather than what might be useful about it. He had not understood at the time how rare that was. He was beginning to understand it now in ways that felt slightly like fear. "I'll be back by 11, she said. 11. He kept his voice level. "You said midnight last week." "The buses are slower in the rain." She was adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, not looking at him. "I'd rather be home earlier." "Where are you going, Serena?" It wasn't inflected as a question. He'd tried questions. He'd tried the careful architectural approach, asking about her evening, asking about the cold, asking if she needed anything, waiting to see where she'd leave an opening. She didn't leave openings. Whatever she was doing with her evenings, she had made a deliberate decision to compartmentalize it, and she was better at compartmentalization than he had given her credit for. She looked at him. Her expression was not guilty. This was the thing he kept returning to, kept turning over in the dark hours of the night, when she was asleep beside him and he was looking at the ceiling with his brain running its usual inventory. A guilty person had a particular quality of looking at you, something slightly averted, slightly overeager in its directness. The performance of innocence that always revealed itself by trying too hard. Serena looked at him the way she looked at everything, straight on, with that quality of full attention that usually felt like a gift and right now felt like a wall. "Out," she said. "That's not an answer." "I know." She picked up her keys from the bowl by the door. "Good night, Min-jae." The elevator doors opened, she stepped in, and the doors closed, and he stood in the kitchen of his 43-floor penthouse holding a glass of scotch, watching the polished steel doors reflect back an image of a man who controlled billions of dollars and multiple city officials and a criminal network that stretched from the port of Seattle through Portland and down to the Bay Area, and who had just been told goodnight by his 6 months pregnant wife in a tone that did not invite further discussion. He set the glass down. He called Dae-sung. "I need a car." He gave her 4 blocks. This was calculation, not sentiment. Serena knew his vehicles, knew the silver Audi he used for business meetings, knew the black Escalade that came with a driver, knew the 2 nondescript sedans that his security detail rotated through the building's underground garage. He took a car she'd never seen him use, a 4-year-old gray Honda Civic that was registered to a mid-level accountant in his organization's payroll structure and that he kept for exactly these kinds of purposes. He drove it himself. He was good at not being seen. He picked her up visually as she reached the intersection of 4th and Pike, heading south. The rain was heavier now, and she had an umbrella up, dark navy, and she walked with the deliberate, careful pace of someone used to navigating wet pavement in flat shoes, someone who had given up on hurrying in bad weather a long time ago. She wasn't looking around, wasn't checking over her shoulder. Either she trusted that she wasn't being followed, or she'd made peace with the possibility that she might be. Both possibilities bothered him for different reasons. He followed at a distance that felt uncomfortably large, 4, sometimes 5 car lengths, and twice lost visual only to pick her up again at the next corner. She was heading south and east, out of the dense commercial corridor, into the seam between downtown and the neighborhoods that the development maps in his conference room labeled as transitional zones, and which meant, in practice, streets where the buildings were old and the rents were technically low, and the city had been quietly accepting offers on properties for the past 18 months, through an intermediary firm that traced back, eventually, and through considerable effort, to a holding company that Min Jae controlled. He knew these streets. He'd walked some of them, years ago, before everything. He hadn't been back. He watched Serena walk through them like she belonged there. She stopped at a corner market. Small, independently owned, the kind that was already on one of his lists as a property on a block that had been flagged for acquisition, and went inside for 6 minutes. When she came out, she was carrying a paper grocery bag, in addition to the thermos, and she'd added it to a tote that hung from her right shoulder, and she walked differently now, slightly forward-leaning, adjusting for the weight. 6 months pregnant, carrying groceries, walking alone at night in the rain, he felt something that he identified after a moment as anger, clean and sharp and simple. It was the easiest emotion he'd had in weeks, and he recognized that this was part of what was making him angry, that her keeping this secret from him had robbed him of this particular simplicity for 11 days, had left him instead with the grinding, low-level anxiety of not knowing, which was an unfamiliar condition for a man who made it his business to know everything. She turned onto a street he knew from property documents but not from personal geography. Residential on the left, a block of mixed commercial on the right, the commercial being the kind of mix that meant a dry cleaner that had been there for 30 years, a Vietnamese grocery, a shuttered laundromat, and what had once been a restaurant but was now a boarded-up space with a for-lease sign that his property team had been negotiating to pull for 2 months. At the end of the block, set back slightly, was a building he recognized from satellite imagery but had never looked at closely because it wasn't on the acquisition list. Too old, too small, not commercially viable. The kind of building that was going to come down as collateral when the surrounding block was redeveloped. It was an old church building converted to some other use. The stained glass windows had been covered with plywood on the outside and warm light filtered through the gaps. There was a hand-lettered sign above the side entrance that he couldn't read from this distance. Serena went in the side door without hesitating, like she'd done it 1,000 times. Min Jae sat in the gray Civic with the engine off and the rain hammering the roof and looked at the building. Then he got out of the car. The side entrance led into a stairwell that went down half a flight to a basement level. From outside the door, which he didn't open, which he stood beside with the particular stillness of a man who had spent years in situations where noise was a liability, he could hear voices. Multiple. The ambient sound of a large room with people in it. The kind of acoustic texture that comes from perhaps 30 or 40 people in a space that wasn't designed with acoustics in mind. The sound of metal on metal, something being stirred. The smell of food, broth-based, heavy with aromatics, something being cooked in quantity. He tried the door. It opened. He stood in the stairwell. Below him, the basement was lit with a combination of overhead fluorescents and some warmer supplemental lighting that someone had added in the form of standing lamps plugged into extension cords. The space had been arranged with rows of folding tables and mismatched chairs. At the far end was a kitchen pass-through window where 2 people were ladling food into bowls. Along the near wall, a line of people waited. Adults, children, elderly, a range of ages and conditions that Min Jae took in with the trained rapid assessment of someone who has spent years reading groups of people for threat vectors and had never, until this moment, turned that assessment toward something like this. He saw families. A woman with 3 children under 10 who were sitting with the patient subdued tiredness of children who had been tired many times before. An elderly man in a coat that had once been good quality and wasn't anymore, eating with great precision and dignity. A couple who might have been 30 or 60, hard to tell, the kind of aging that happens faster than it should. A young woman, maybe 20, maybe less, holding a sleeping infant against her chest with one arm and eating with her free hand with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to do everything one-handed. And there, behind this kitchen pass-through, was Serena. She'd removed her jacket. She was wearing the gray sweater with the sleeves pushed up, standing beside a large pot, and she was talking to the woman next to her while she ladled soup. Talking easily, laughing at something, the way she laughed when she was with people she was genuinely comfortable with. The laugh that Min-jae knew from their early time together and that had become rarer as his work consumed more of the architecture of their shared life. It was the laugh she saved for when she forgot to be careful. She was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy and everything to do with being exactly where she wanted to be. Min-jae stood very still in the stairwell and felt something he couldn't immediately name move through him. He watched for 40 minutes. He watched her move through the room, refilling bowls, crouching down to talk to the children at the family table at a level that put her face at their height, helping an elderly woman find a seat that wasn't in the draft from the window. Going back to the kitchen and returning with a second bag from whatever she'd bought at the corner market, which turned out to be oranges, which she distributed one by one to the children like it was the most natural thing in the world. He watched her sit for 15 minutes with the elderly man in the good coat that wasn't good anymore, talking with him in the particular way she had of giving people her complete attention, and he watched the man's posture change over the course of that conversation, the slight straightening, the small dignification that happens when someone is being genuinely listened to. He watched her and he felt the anger dissolve, and what replaced it was worse. What replaced it was the vertiginous sensation of realizing that he had been in a room with a painting every day for 3 years, and only now, from the wrong angle, in a doorway in the rain, was he seeing what it actually was. He left before she could see him. He came back the next night, and the night after that. He told Dae-sung nothing. He took the Civic and he parked it differently each time, and he stood in different positions. Sometimes the stairwell, sometimes a vantage point from the alley behind the building where a window well gave him a narrow view of the room's interior, once from a position near the side entrance where he could hear but not see. He built up a picture the way he built up pictures on everything, methodically, patiently, from multiple angles, looking for the thing he might have missed. What he found, each time, was the same thing. His wife, who was 6 months pregnant, and who walked 40 minutes through the rain twice a week to stand in a converted basement and ladle soup and distribute whatever she'd stopped to buy at the corner market on the way, and who was known here, genuinely known, the way you know people when you've been showing up consistently for a long time. The staff, 2 women who managed the kitchen and a rotation of other volunteers, greeted her by name. The regulars knew her. The children in the family group had a specific reaction to her arrival that was the particular happiness of children who have learned that a certain person's presence reliably means good things. On the 4th night, he overheard her name used with a familiarity that suggested she'd been coming here not for weeks, but for much longer. He started asking questions through channels that couldn't be traced back to him. What he found took 3 days and made him feel a specific kind of cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The shelter in the basement of the converted building had been operating for 11 years. It was funded through small donations, a patchwork of municipal grants that were perpetually underfunded and perpetually at risk, and the direct personal contributions of several long-term volunteers. Serena Hartwell, she had not taken his name, a choice he had understood as independence and now understood as something more complicated, had been volunteering there for 4 years. She was not just a volunteer. She was, according to the operational records his contact pulled, listed as a founding contributor on a subsequent funding application from 3 years ago, which meant she had been connected to this place in some capacity even before that. He sat with this information in his car outside the Harrow building for a long time. Then he pulled up the redevelopment files. The shelter was in Zone 7 of the East Side Corridor project. Zone 7 was scheduled for demolition and ground clearance in March, 5 months away, which was also, give or take 3 weeks, when Serena was due. He had been in that conference room when the zone maps were approved. He had signed off on the acquisition strategy. He had authorized the timeline. He sat with this for a long time, too. On the 7th night, he did something he hadn't done before. He went inside, not through the stairwell this time. He went through the main entrance on the street level, which opened into a small reception area where a young man was sitting at a folding table with a sign-in sheet. The young man looked at Min-jae. At the expensive coat, the close-cut hair, the general quality of someone who had not arrived here by necessity, with the practiced non-judgmental assessment of someone who worked intake at a place where the whole philosophy was that you didn't assess. "Volunteer or guest?" the young man said. "Guest," Min-jae said. It was the only honest answer available. "Sign in if you want. You don't have to. Food's downstairs until 9. He went downstairs. He didn't take a bowl. He stood near the wall and he watched the room. And he watched Serena, who was deep in conversation with one of the kitchen staff and hadn't seen him come in. The room smelled like broth and wet coats and something baking somewhere, and there was noise, real noise, the accumulated noise of people in a warm space after cold, which sounded different from the noise of a restaurant or a party because it had a quality of relief underneath it that those other noises didn't. He watched a child, maybe 7, a boy with overlarge sneakers and a careful watchfulness in his face that Min-jae recognized from somewhere he didn't want to look directly at, come up to the serving window and ask, in a voice too small for the room, if there was more bread. He watched Serena turn from her conversation, look at the boy with full attention, and say, "Of course there is, hold on," and come back 30 seconds later with not 1 roll but 3, and watch the boy's face do the thing that a child's face does when it has received more than it asked for and doesn't quite know what to do with the excess of it. Min-jae looked at his hands. He had large hands, capable hands. He was aware, in a way that he was usually able to keep theoretical, of the specific things those hands had been used for over the course of his life. He looked at the boy, who was holding 3 rolls and still had that particular uncertain joy on his face, and he felt something tear loose somewhere in his chest. He left before Serena could see him. He drove back to the Harrow building and he sat in the underground garage for a long time before he went upstairs. But she was awake when he came in. She was in the reading chair, the mismatched green one that had no business being in that apartment, with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. The lamp beside her was at its warmest setting. She was wearing socks with small repeating birds on them. She looked at him and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "You're wet." "It's raining. You've been standing outside somewhere." He took off his coat. "I went for a walk." She watched him. She had the particular quality of attention she always had, but there was something different underneath it tonight, a kind of weight. "Min-jae," she said, "I need to make a call." "It's 11:30. It won't take long." "Min-jae." Her voice was level. Not pleading, not accusatory, just her name for him, said in the way she said it when she wanted him to stop performing. "Sit down." He sat on the couch across from her. The thermos was on the coffee table between them. She must have rinsed it out before she came home. It sat there in the lamplight, dented and worn, its faded blue the color of something that had once been bright. He looked at it. She looked at him. "You followed me," she said. Not a question. He didn't insult her by denying it. "When?" "The 3rd night. I stayed in the stairwell." "And after?" "I came back." He met her eyes. "Several times." She was quiet. Her hands were folded in her lap over the book she'd stopped reading. He waited for the anger, expected it, had cataloged the possible forms it might take, had prepared responses to several of them. He had spent a fair amount of his adult life preparing responses to anger, because anger was a legible condition, and legible conditions could be managed. What he wasn't prepared for was what actually happened, which was that she closed the book carefully and set it on the side table and looked at him for a long, exhausted moment, and then said, very quietly, "I wanted to tell you." "Then why didn't you?" She exhaled, looked away toward the window where the rain was still streaking down the glass. "Because I didn't know what you would do with it," she said. "What I would do with it. With knowing, about where I come from, about—" She stopped, started again. "About what that place is to me." "Serena, I know you, Min-jae." She said it without heat. Matter of fact. "I know how you look at information. I know what you do with things that can be used." She paused. "I didn't want to become something you knew how to use." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. He said, "That's what you think of me." "That's what I know about you," she said. It's not the same as what I think of you. She looked at him directly now. I love you. I married you. I'm having your daughter. A pause. And I know exactly what you are. He looked at the thermos. Tell me about the thermos, he said. She was quiet for a long time. It was my mother's, she said finally. He waited. We lived in that neighborhood when I was 8, 9, 10. She picked up the thermos, turned it in her hands, her fingers finding those worn spots on the grip automatically, without thought. We didn't always have... We went through a bad time after my dad left. My mom worked 2 jobs and it still wasn't enough sometimes. For a while She stopped. There was a shelter. Not that building then. Different building, same organization. They fed us through 2 winters. She set the thermos back down. My mom carried that thermos every night she volunteered, after we got back on our feet. She said it was how you paid something back. You gave your time to the same place that gave you its time. Your mother's gone, Min-jae said. 4 years ago, cancer. She said it plainly, the way you say things that have been held for long enough that they've been worn smooth. I started volunteering 6 months after she died. I brought the thermos. A beat. It seemed right. He looked at the thermos. He thought about Zone 7. He thought about the demolition timeline. March. The same month. He thought about sitting in that conference room signing off on acquisition maps, while his wife was carrying groceries through the rain to a building he was planning to erase. A building that contained, apparently, the only remaining physical object that connected her to her mother, and to a chapter of her life she had never told him about because she was afraid of what he would do with it. He thought about the boy with the overlarge sneakers and the 3 rolls. Min-jae, Serena said, say something. He looked at her, at the thermos, at her hands, which were still, the way they got when she was waiting for something that mattered. I need to make a call, he said. At midnight, I need to make a call. He stood. His voice came out rougher than he intended. It's not about... He stopped, breathed. I need to pull some documents. She watched him. What documents? He looked at her for a long moment, at her face which was open and tired and pregnant with his daughter, and which had been carrying this weight, the weight of the secret, the weight of the fear that he would weaponize her past, the weight of being married to a man like him while also being the person she actually was, for years, apparently. Years in which he had been standing in rooms with a painting and seeing a wall. The East Side corridor, he said. Something shifted in her face. What about it? We need to talk about Zone 7, and watching her expression change, watching the moment she understood what he was saying, what he must have put together, what it meant. Watching her face move through confusion to comprehension, to something that was not quite relief, but was in the neighborhood of it, and something else underneath it that he recognized after a moment, as the particular grief of a secret kept too long finally arriving at the surface. He understood, for the first time in his adult life, that power and control were not the same thing, and that he had spent 19 years confusing one for the other. He took out his phone. He called Dae-sung. Pull the Zone 7 files, he said, when Dae-sung answered on the second ring. All of them. The acquisition documents, the demolition timeline, the council liaison contacts, everything. A pause. I need them on my desk in the morning. Silence on the other end. Then, boss, it's midnight. I know what time it is. Another silence. Then, okay. He hung up. Serena was watching him from the reading chair with an expression he had never seen on her before. He didn't have a name for it yet. He thought he might spend some time learning its name. The shelter is in Zone 7, he said. I know, she said. I found out 2 months ago. A pause. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. 2 months. I didn't know what you would... She stopped. I was scared. Of me. Of losing it, she said. Of watching you have to choose. Her hands tightened on the thermos in her lap. I didn't want to be the thing that made the choice complicated. He looked at his wife, 6 months pregnant, in a mismatched green chair, holding her dead mother's thermos at midnight in an apartment that cost more per square foot than the shelter's entire annual operating budget. And he felt something move through his chest that he hadn't felt since he was a different person. Younger, less built. Before he understood that the world would give you what you were willing to take, and punish you for everything you let yourself care about. He felt the specific weight of a choice arriving. Get some sleep, he said. Min-jae, get some sleep. He crossed to her, crouched in front of the chair so that he was at her level, and looked at her directly. Close enough to see the exhaustion in her face, the traces of the evening's warmth still there underneath it. We're going to talk about this, all of it, but not tonight. A beat. Tonight I need to think. She held his gaze, then she nodded, once, and reached out and touched the side of his face with her palm, briefly, the way she sometimes did. A gesture he had never been able to fully decode and had stopped trying to, because some things weren't meant to be decoded. Don't disappear into your head, she said. I'll try. She didn't look convinced. She wasn't wrong to be unconvinced. He went to his study and he pulled up the Zone 7 files on his own system. He had remote access to everything, had always maintained it, one of the foundational principles of how he operated being that he needed to be able to see everything from everywhere at any time. And he sat in the dark with the documents spread across 3 screens, and he looked at them. Property maps, acquisition records, demolition schedules, displacement assessments. The word displacement rendered in the neutral technical language of real estate development, which made it sound like a logistical process rather than what it was, which was the removal of people from places they had built their lives around. He looked at the shelter's footprint on the map. Small, a fraction of the block. He looked at the demolition date, March 14th. His daughter was due March 9th. He sat with this for a long time. Then he opened a new document. He began to write. By 3 a.m. he had a draft. By 4 a.m. it was no longer a draft. At 4:17 a.m. he sent 3 emails. To Dae-sung, to the organization's lead property attorney, and to the city liaison who managed the East Side Corridor permits. And in each of them he used language that was not ambiguous and was not open to interpretation, the language of a man who had made a decision and whose decisions were not revisited. He closed his laptop. He went to the bedroom. Serena was asleep, one hand curled under her cheek, the thermos on the nightstand because she hadn't put it away yet. In the low light from the city outside the windows, her face was relaxed in a way it hadn't been for weeks. The absence of the weight he'd been watching her carry without knowing what it was. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the thermos. Then he went to his side of the bed and lay down in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the boy with the 3 rolls and the old man in the good coat and 30 families in a warm basement eating soup on a rainy Tuesday. He thought about Serena at 8 years old in this city, in this neighborhood, carrying a thermos to a building that kept her warm. He thought about what it meant that he had been, unknowingly, preparing to erase her. Sleep didn't come for a long time. When it did, it brought no dreams he could remember. Only, somewhere underneath, the particular texture of a decision that has been made correctly and can't be unmade. By morning, 3 of his most senior captains had received the emails. By morning, the East Side Corridor timeline had a new notation in the system. By morning, Kang Min-jae had done something he had not done in 19 years of running an organization that survived on certainty and fear. He had changed his mind. What he didn't know yet, what none of the emails or documents or zone maps could have told him, what would arrive 2 days later in the form of a phone call from Dae-sung at 6 a.m., voice tight in the particular way it got when the news was serious, was that his 3 most senior captains hadn't just received the emails. They had responded, and not in any way that Min-jae had anticipated. The call came at 6:04 a.m. Min-jae was already awake. He'd been awake since 5, standing at the kitchen counter with coffee he wasn't tasting, watching the city come back into resolution through the rain-streaked windows, the gray light arriving slowly, the way it always did in October, like the day was reluctant to commit. Serena was still asleep. He'd checked twice. His phone buzzed on the counter, and he picked it up on the first ring. "Talk," he said. Dae-sung's voice was flat in the specific way it got when he was managing something. "You need to come in." I said, "Talk." A pause. The quality of the silence was informative. "Not on the phone, Min-jae." He looked at the coffee, set it down. "How bad?" "Come in." He hung up. He went to the bedroom door and looked at Serena. Still asleep, still with the thermos on the nightstand, one hand under her cheek, and stood there for a moment doing nothing. Then he went to the closet and dressed in the dark without turning on the light, moving by the particular spatial memory of a man who had spent years waking up and leaving rooms without wanting to disturb what he was leaving. He wrote a note on his back of a receipt from his jacket pocket. It said, "Back by 9. Don't carry anything heavy." He left it on the kitchen counter where she'd see it when she came for coffee. He took the elevator down. The organization's operational headquarters occupied the top 2 floors of a commercial building in Sodo that presented to the world as a mid-tier logistics company. The signage on the lobby directory read, Harrow Pacific Transit, LLC. The actual employees of Harrow Pacific Transit, 4 people whose job was to make the company's operational paper trail coherent and boring, worked on the 6th floor and had been carefully selected for their incuriosity. The 8th and 9th floors were accessed by a separate elevator that required a coded keycard and were not listed on the directory. Min-jae arrived at 6:41 a.m. to find 3 cars already in the private lot. He recognized all of them. The first belonged to Dae-sung, the second to Park Hyun-woo, who ran the organization's port operations and had been with Min-jae for 12 years, and who Min-jae trusted with the particular qualified trust of knowing exactly where the man's loyalties began and ended. The third car belonged to Jin Soo-han, who handled the real estate arm and who had been CC'd on the Zone 7 email at 4:17 a.m. and whose presence here at 6:41 in the morning told Min-jae everything he needed to know about the temperature of what was waiting upstairs. He took the private elevator. The 9th floor conference room had a long table and 8 chairs and a wall of windows that looked out over the industrial waterfront. The lights were fully on, harsh, overhead, the kind that left no softness anywhere. Dae-sung was standing. Park Hyun-woo was seated, one ankle crossed over his knee, which was his default posture for situations he wanted to appear relaxed about. Jin Soo-han was at the window with his back to the room. Min-jae came in, set his phone and keys on the table, and sat at the head. "Okay," he said. Jin Soo-han turned from the window. He was 51, compact, with close-cropped gray at his temples and the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now just dense. The features compressed by decades of tension into something that communicated primarily that he had been through things and had not been softened by them. He and Min-jae had known each other for 16 years. They were not friends. They had a relationship built on mutual utility and mutual wariness, which Min-jae had always considered more reliable than friendship. "The East Side Corridor," Jin said. No preamble. "Yes." "You sent that email at 4 in the morning. I was awake. You're pulling Zone 7. Not a question. Jin's voice was controlled, but there was something running underneath it, a current that Min-jae clocked immediately. The demolition timeline, the acquisition finalization. You're pulling it. I'm reviewing it. Your email didn't say review. Jin came away from the window. He put both hands flat on the table but didn't sit, which was its own kind of statement. Your email said halt. Immediate halt. Those are your words. They are. Min-jae, Dae-sung said it quietly, from his position near the door. It was his de-escalation voice, the one he used when he thought something was about to go sideways and wanted to slow the rate at which it arrived at sideways. The partners were informed of the March timeline 6 months ago. Yoon Group has already moved capital based on that schedule. The city liaison works for us, Min-jae said. He works with us, Park Hyun-woo said from his seat. His voice was mild. He had a talent for mildness that Min-jae had never fully trusted. There's a difference. And he's been managing 3 council members on our behalf for the past 8 months, based on a March groundbreaking. If we pull now, I didn't say pull. I said halt. Min-jae looked around the table. 3 faces, 3 different configurations of the same thing, the particular careful tension of men who had invested heavily in a direction and were watching the compass move. A review, 2 weeks. 2 weeks costs Yoon Group. I know what it costs. Do you? Jin said it flat, without inflection, and that flatness was worse than anger would have been. Because Yoon Group has $240 million tied to the March schedule, they have construction contracts signed. They have pre-sales on 12 units in Tower A. If we come to them with a 2-week halt and no explanation, tell them there's a permitting issue. There is no permitting issue. Tell them anyway. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Min-jae had been in enough rooms to know the difference between silence that was shock and silence that was calculation. And what was happening in this room was calculation. Three men running numbers, running scenarios, running the geometry of what they knew and what they didn't know and what they were going to do about it. Jin straightened. He picked up his hands from the table. He looked at Min-jae with the careful look of a man choosing his next words very deliberately. "Is this about your wife?" he said. The room got very still. Min-jae looked at Jin for a long moment. His face did not change. This was a skill he had spent years developing, and it held now, even though what was happening underneath it was not still at all. "Say that again," Min-jae said. Jin held his gaze. To his credit, and Min-jae noted this, filed it, would return to it, he didn't flinch. "There's a shelter in Zone 7. I had someone pull the volunteer records after your email. Your wife's name is on them going back 4 years. A beat. The email came at 4 in the morning. You haven't slept." He paused. "I'm asking because I need to understand what we're actually dealing with." Park Hyun-woo had very carefully uncrossed his ankle. Dae-sung, near the door, had gone extremely still. "What you're dealing with," Min-jae said, "is a halt order on Zone 7 pending review. That's the entire scope of what you're dealing with." He kept his voice level, kept his hands flat on the table. "Whether my wife's name appears in a document you had pulled without my authorization, which we will discuss separately, Jin, is not relevant to the operational question in front of you." "It's completely relevant," Jin said. "If this is personal, then we're not making a business decision. We're making a personal decision with business consequences, which is a different thing entirely, and which, you had someone pull my wife's records." The shift in Min-jae's voice was small. It was very deliberate. It was the kind of small shift that people who knew Min-jae recognized as the moment a conversation changed categories. Jin heard it. His jaw tightened. "I had someone pull the shelter's records and cross-reference them against my household. Against the zones relevant, against my wife." Min-jae stood. He did it slowly, unhurried, which was more effective than doing it fast. He was looking at Jin steadily, and Jin was looking back, and neither of them was moving. "Without my authorization, without consulting Dae-sung, without a word to me." A pause that lasted exactly as long as he needed it to. "That's what happened." Jin said nothing. "Park," Min-jae said, without looking away from Jin, "what was your involvement in this?" Park Hyun-woo's mild voice came from slightly to his left. "Jin called me at 5:30, told me what the email said, asked me to be here." A pause. "That's the extent of it." Dae-sung. "He called me at 5:45, Dae-sung said. "Same." Min-jae looked at Jin for another 4 seconds. Then he sat back down. "The halt stands," he said. 2 weeks, pending my review of the Zone 7 impact assessment. If Yoon Group has questions, they bring them to me directly." He picked up his phone. "The question of you pulling records on my household, we're going to have a separate conversation about that, not today." He looked around the table. "Anything else?" Park Hyun-woo said very carefully, "The Yoon Group representative is going to want answers within 48 hours. They're not patient people. I know what kind of people they are." Min-jae. Dae-sung stepped away from the door. He had a way of inserting himself into a room's center of gravity without moving quickly, something Min-jae had observed and appreciated for 17 years. "Yoon Group is not our only exposure here. The council liaison has 3 city officials whose cooperation we've spent 18 months cultivating. If we shift the timeline without a clear explanation, those relationships, I'll handle the liaison. And the partners downstream? There are 4 property groups waiting on Zone 7 clearance before they can move on their own acquisitions. If we halt Zone 7, they halt. That's a cascade." Dae-sung kept his voice careful, kept it the voice of a man presenting information rather than arguing a position. This was what made him valuable. This was also right now what made him difficult. "I'm not saying don't halt it. I'm saying we need to understand the full shape of what this costs before we're committed." "I already understand it." "Do you?" Dae-sung met his eyes. It was the same question Jin had asked, and it landed differently because Dae-sung was not running an agenda. He was running concern, which was a harder thing to deflect. Because 3 hours ago you were asleep and now you're halting a $250 million development timeline. And I want to make sure, I'm sure, that you've thought through, Dae Sung. The name came out quiet. I'm sure. A silence. Then Dae Sung nodded once, short, and stepped back. Min Jae looked at the table, at the three men around it who had each, in their own way, spent years building something alongside him, and who were now watching that something potentially absorb a hit for reasons they didn't fully understand, and he was not going to explain. 2 weeks, he said. Keep Yoon Group managed. Keep the liaison managed. If anyone needs to reach me directly, they call Dae Sung first. He stood. We're done. He walked out. He sat in the Civic in the private lot for 11 minutes before starting the engine. The morning had gone full gray, that particular Pacific Northwest gray that wasn't threatening, just heavy, like the sky had pulled a second coat on and wasn't taking it off. The water in the distance was the same gray as the sky, which was the same gray as the pavement, and the whole city looked like it had been made from the same material and was in the process of returning to it. He thought about what Jin had said. Is this about your wife? The honest answer was yes and no, and the fact that the answer was that complicated was itself information he was still processing. It was about Serena. It was also about the boy with 3 rolls. It was about the old man's coat. It was about a demolition date in March and a due date in March, and the particular horror of having signed documents that were going to flatten the last physical place that connected his wife to her dead mother in the same month his daughter was going to be born, without ever knowing any of it. It was about something he didn't have a word for yet. Something that had been loosened in him by the image of Serena behind the kitchen pass-through, laughing, with her sleeves pushed up in the full unguarded brightness of being exactly where she wanted to be. He started the engine. He drove. He was not going back to the Harrow building. He took the long route through the neighborhood instead, the one that went past the shelter, and he slowed when he reached that block. In daylight, the building looked older than it did at night. The plywood over the stained glass was weathered and peeling at the corners. The hand-lettered sign above the side door, which he could read now, which said East Side Community Table in faded paint, had been touched up recently in one corner, but the rest of it was original. The lettering slightly uneven in the way that handmade things are, which is to say it looked like it had been made by someone for whom it mattered. The block around it was quiet in the early morning. A woman walking a dog. A delivery truck idling 2 addresses down. The Vietnamese grocery with its metal gate still down. The buildings on either side of the shelter were in various stages of the particular decay that precedes redevelopment, not falling apart exactly, just arriving at the end of their current usefulness, waiting to be used differently. He looked at the shelter. He thought about standing in that stairwell in the dark. He thought about standing in that room and feeling something tear loose in his chest. He drove on. Serena was at the kitchen counter when he came in. She had coffee and she'd made toast, and she was reading something on her phone with the focused tilt of someone following a story, and she looked up when he came through the door with the particular expression she wore when she was deciding how to read him. Before 9, she said. I told you before 9. You told me back by 9 there's a difference. She set her phone down. How was it? He took off his coat. Fine. Min Jae. He looked at her. Jin was there, she said. Not a question. He hung his coat, came to the counter and poured coffee without responding. I know you sent those emails, she said. I woke up at 2 and you weren't in bed. I looked at your desk at 3 and you were still at the computer. And I know what the East Side Corridor is, and I know what Zone 7 is. And so when you sent emails at 4 in the morning, she stopped. What did Jin say? It doesn't matter what Jin said. It matters to me. He turned with the coffee. He pulled your volunteer records. Something moved across her face. It was quick, and he caught it. A flash of something cold. The specific expression of someone absorbing news that confirms a fear they'd hoped wouldn't be confirmed. Then it was gone, and her face was level again. How? The shelter keeps records for grant applications. It's not private information. He paused. He cross-referenced it after I sent the halt order, before 6 a.m. He was checking if the halt was personal. Yes. She was quiet. She picked up her coffee and held it and looked at the counter. And is it? Is it what? Personal. She looked up. Is the halt personal? He looked at her steadily. What do you think? I think you went out at 6 a.m. after sending emails at 4 a.m. about a development project that happens to contain the shelter I've been volunteering at for 4 years. And I think when you came home, you looked like you'd been through something. She set the coffee down. I think it's personal. It's also right, he said. She blinked. Something shifted in her face that he didn't fully catch before she looked away. Don't do that, she said quietly. Do what? Make it... She stopped, pressed her lips together. Don't make it about being right. Don't make it something clean. She looked back at him. I've been carrying this for 2 months. I've been lying next to you every night knowing that building was on your list and not knowing how to... Her voice was level, but there was something working in it, something just below the surface that she was managing carefully. I was scared that if I told you, you'd stop it, and then you'd resent it. And I was scared that if I didn't tell you, you'd find out and feel... She stopped again. I didn't want you to feel manipulated. You didn't manipulate anything. Didn't I? She met his eyes. I kept it from you. I let you follow me. I sat in this chair last night and told you about my mother and the thermos, and 2 hours later you're sending halt orders at 4 a.m. Her voice didn't break. It was steady and tired and honest in the way that exhausted people are honest, without the energy for anything but the direct line. How is that not manipulation? Because manipulation is a choice, he said. You were scared. Scared people still make choices. Yes, he said. They do. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the gray morning had gotten slightly lighter. Not better, just lighter, the difference between dark gray and medium gray that passed for progress in October. Serena looked at her hands on the counter. Is it going to cost you a lot? She said. The halt. I'll manage it. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. Yes, he said. It's going to cost a lot. She absorbed this. She didn't apologize, which was the right choice, and he noticed it. What she said instead was, what happens in 2 weeks? I make a decision about Zone 7. What kind of decision? He looked at the thermos on the counter where she'd left it after rinsing it out. The dented blue of it, the worn grip. I don't know yet, he said, which was not entirely true. He had a fairly clear idea of the direction, but the shape of it, the how, the mechanism, the thing that would need to happen to make the protection stick in a way that didn't just last 2 weeks and then get rolled back by financial pressure and Jin's ambitions and Yoon Group's timeline, the shape of it was still forming. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Dae-sung, Yoon Group rep called. Wants a meeting tomorrow. He typed back. Tomorrow afternoon, my terms. Then, before he could put the phone down, a second message from Dae-sung, and this one was different in tone. He could read Dae-sung's tone in texts the way some people read faces, from the word choice, from what was and wasn't said. Also, Jin made 3 calls this morning after you left. Don't know to who yet. Working on it. Min-jae looked at the message for a long time. Then he put the phone face down on the counter. Serena was watching him. She had the particular stillness of a woman who had gotten good at reading a room in which her husband's face was the primary text. What? She said. Nothing. Min-jae, not now. He picked up his coffee. I need to think. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and her coffee, and she went to the reading chair, and she sat in it, and she opened her book, and she did the thing she did where she gave him space by making herself fully present in a different part of the room, which was its own kind of pressure, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. He stood at the counter and thought about Jin's 3 calls. Jin had been with the organization for 16 years. He'd come up through the real estate arm when it was still a small operation, 2 warehouses and a handful of properties on the south side. He'd been the one who'd seen the potential in the port-adjacent development corridor before Min-jae fully had, who'd built the relationship with Yoon Group, who'd assembled the East Side corridor deal over 3 years of quiet negotiation. He was not someone who made unnecessary calls. He was not someone who panicked. 3 calls before 8 in the morning, immediately after leaving a meeting where he'd been shut down, was not panic. That was movement. Min-jae thought about what kind of movement. He thought about who Jin would call. Not Yoon Group directly. That would be too exposed, too direct, too easily traced. Not the city liaison. The liaison was Min Jae's relationship, not Jin's, and both of them knew it. He would call people in the middle, people whose interests aligned with the East Side Corridor timeline, people who could create pressure from angles that didn't point back to Jin. Min Jae had built this organization on knowing where every piece was on the board at all times. He felt the cold clarity of understanding that a piece had just moved without his direction. He looked at Serena in the reading chair. She was reading, or performing reading well enough that the distinction didn't matter, and her face had the softness it got when she was genuinely absorbed, the small relaxation around the eyes. She had been carrying a secret for 2 months. She had been scared. She had sat in that chair and told him about her mother with the kind of honesty that cost something and had trusted that the cost was worth paying. He thought about what she'd said. "I didn't want you to feel manipulated." He thought about the boy with the rolls and the old man and the 30 families in the warm basement. He thought about Jin's 3 calls. He picked up his phone and called Dae-sung back. "Find out who the calls were to," he said when Dae-sung picked up. "All 3. I want names by tonight." "Working on it. And get me everything we have on the downstream partners, the 4 groups waiting on Zone 7 clearance, financials, exposure levels, who they talk to." He paused. "I want to know what leverage looks like in that circle." Dae-sung was quiet for a moment. "You're not just reviewing Zone 7. "No," Min Jae said. "I'm not." Another pause. Then, "How far are you taking this?" Min Jae looked at the thermos on the counter. "I don't know yet," he said. "But wherever it goes on my terms, not Jin's." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, feeling the shape of the morning, the meeting, the calls, Serena in the chair, the thermos, the demolition date in March, his daughter due in March. All of it assembled around a center that was still forming, still arriving at its own conclusion. Then his phone rang. Not Dae-sung, not Jin, not a number he recognized. He answered. "Min Jae." The voice was older, measured, the voice of a man who was accustomed to being listened to. "This is Director Yoon." Not the representative, not the liaison, the director himself. David Yoon, 71 years old, the patriarch of Yoon Group, who had not called Min Jae directly in 4 years, who communicated exclusively through intermediaries and signed documents and the language of financial arrangements, who did not make personal calls unless something had moved him out of the architecture of normal business and into the more immediate territory of a man whose interests were being directly threatened. Min Jae felt something settle in him. The cold clarity again, but deeper than before because this was no longer a business problem. This was a declaration. "Director Yoon," Min Jae said. His voice came out even. "I wasn't expecting your call." "I imagine not." The old man's English was precise, slightly formal, the English of someone who had learned it as a second language and had used it for 50 years to make money. "I spoke with Jin Soo-han this morning." There it was, one of the 3 calls. Min Jae turned away from Serena without moving his feet, angling his body toward the window, reducing what she could read from his face. "I see," he said. He expressed some concern about the Zone 7 timeline. A pause. "I share that concern. I sent a halt order for a 2-week review. That's standard procedure on a project of this scale. When new information..." "Min Jae?" The old man said his name the way people said names when they wanted the name to function as a period. "We have known each other for 9 years. Let us not use the language of standard procedure." A breath on the line. Deliberate. The breath of a man who breathed deliberately. $240 million is not a number that accommodates a 2-week review without explanation. You know this. The explanation is that I've identified elements of the Zone 7 impact assessment that require closer examination before I'm comfortable proceeding. Elements. Yes. Jin tells me the element in question is a community shelter occupying a small portion of the zone's footprint. Min Jae said nothing. The silence was its own answer, and he knew it, and the old man knew it. "My son," Yoon said. He used the word occasionally, not as affection, but as a specific kind of authority. The authority of a man who had made you and believed that making you gave him a claim on you. "I have built my business on one principle. Money does not move backward. It does not pause. It does not review itself." Another deliberate breath. "If Zone 7 does not proceed on schedule, I will begin conversations with the other partners about alternative structures for the corridor project. Structures that do not require your organization's involvement at the point of contact level. Min-jae felt the cold go deeper. Alternative structures. The phrase was elegant and devastating in equal measure. It meant Yoon Group would find a way to do the project without him, would absorb the delay costs, would restructure the partnership, would cut Min-jae's organization out of the most profitable development deal of the past decade, and in doing so would send a message to every partner, every downstream contact, every city official who had been cultivated over 18 months, that Kang Min-jae's word on a timeline was not a reliable foundation for a $250 million investment. It would not ruin him. He was past the point of being ruined by a single deal. But it would damage him, and damage, in his world, was a different kind of currency, one that compounded. "I hear you, Director," he said. "Good." The warmth in the old man's voice was the warmth of a negotiation point landing cleanly. "I'll expect to hear from you by tomorrow afternoon, before your meeting with my representative." A pause. "Enjoy your morning." The line went dead. Min-jae lowered the phone. He stood at the kitchen window looking at the gray city and felt the shape of the trap he was in. Not the panicked recognition of someone who hadn't seen it coming, but the cold, specific recognition of someone who had walked into something with his eyes partially open and was now assessing the geometry of the walls. Jin had called Yoon directly. Not a mid-level contact, not a pressure point in the middle distance. The man himself, at 6 in the morning, less than 2 hours after leaving the conference room. This was not concern. This was a move. 16 years. 16 years of Jin building the real estate arm, assembling the East Side Corridor deal, cultivating Yoon Group. And now, at the first sign that Min-jae was going to make a decision that cost money for a reason Jin couldn't operationalize, going around him to the one partner with enough leverage to force the issue. Min-jae thought about what that meant, about what you were willing to do after 16 years of working alongside someone, at 6 in the morning, before the day had fully started. He put his phone in his pocket. He turned around. Serena had put the book down. She was watching him with the full attention that she gave things that mattered, and her face was careful in the way it got when she was trying to read a situation without asking questions that might not get honest answers. "I need to go out again," he said. "Min-jae, a few hours." He came to the counter, picked up his keys. "I'll be back before dinner." "Was that Yoon Group?" He looked at her. "I know what Director Yoon's voice sounds like," she said. "You put him on speaker once 2 years ago when you were cooking. You didn't realize I was in the hallway." She paused. "Was that him?" "Yes." "He called you directly?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Because of Zone 7. "Because of Jin," Min-jae said. "Zone 7 is the vehicle." She absorbed this. He watched her do it. Watched the sequence of comprehension move through her face, the understanding of what it meant that Jin had moved this fast, this directly, with this particular partner. She was not naive about what his world looked like. She had married it with full knowledge, or as close to full knowledge as someone outside it could get. She understood the basic mechanics. "How bad?" she said. "Manageable." He said it automatically, the reflex of a man who had spent years calibrating how much reality to give the people around him. Then he looked at her face, which was doing the thing where it waited for the version that was true rather than the version that was managed. And he said, "Bad enough." She nodded once. "Be careful," she said. He put his coat on. "I'll be back before dinner," he said again. She didn't say anything. She watched him go. He found Jin at the office, which was either confidence or arrogance, and Min-jae hadn't decided which yet. Jin was at his desk on the 8th floor with documents spread in front of him and a coffee that was still steaming, which meant he'd been settled here for less than 20 minutes, which meant he'd expected Min-jae to come and had chosen to be findable. This told Min-jae something. He came in without knocking. He closed the door behind him. He stood in front of Jin's desk and he looked at the man. At the dense, compressed face, the gray temples, the hands that were flat on the documents in exactly the same posture they'd been in at the conference table that morning. And he waited. "You called Yoon," Min-jae said. "Yes." Not a denial, not an explanation, just the word, flat, delivered in the tone of a man who had decided that the thing he'd done was defensible and was prepared to defend it.
directly, before 8 a.m. He needed to know before it hit the downstream partners through back channels. If he'd heard it from someone else, you went around me. Jin met his eyes. I went to a partner who had a right to information that directly affects his exposure.
You went around me, Min-jae said again. Not louder. If anything, quieter. To the most senior partner we have, with an incomplete picture 6 hours after I sent a halt order. The picture I gave him was accurate. The picture you gave him was yours. Min-jae put both hands on the edge of the desk. He did it slowly, with the particular deliberateness that meant he was managing what he wanted to do and replacing it with something controlled. There's a difference between accurate and complete. You know that better than anyone.
Jin held his gaze. Something was running behind his eyes. Not fear, Min-jae noted. Not exactly. Something more calculated. The expression of a man who had gone to the table with something and was now waiting to see how the other player responded to it.
You're protecting a soup kitchen, Jin said. The words came out measured, each one placed with care, and the care itself was what made them land hard. With your wife's name on it, on a timeline that's going to cost us Yoon Group if you break it. He leaned back slightly, not releasing Min-jae's gaze. Someone had to make the call. Someone. The word came out soft and dangerous. You decided that someone was you. In the absence of, I was not absent, Jin. The quiet was gone now. Not replaced by volume, but by something else. Something that occupied the space that anger would have taken if he'd been a different man. I sent the order. I was available. I was 20 minutes away. He straightened, took his hands off the desk, put them in his pockets, which was a deliberate choice to remove them from the equation. You didn't call me. You called Yoon. Jin said nothing. Why? Min-jae said. A pause. Because I didn't trust that you'd make the right call, Jin said. The room was very quiet. Min-jae looked at Jin for a long time, long enough that a different person would have felt the need to fill the silence. Jin didn't fill it. He sat in it with the particular stillness of someone who had said the true thing and was waiting to see what the true thing cost. After 16 years, Min-jae said, you don't trust my judgment. On this specific decision, with this specific conflict of interest, Jin's voice was even. No, I don't. And so you went to Yoon? Yes. Min-jae turned away from the desk. He walked to the window. The view here was lower than the 9th floor, the waterfront closer and more industrial, cranes and container stacks and the gray water beyond. He stood there looking at it, 16 years. He thought about what it meant to build something with someone for 16 years, to trust them with the financial infrastructure of an organization that couldn't afford visible fractures, to give them access to relationships that took a decade to cultivate, to sit across from them at a table at 6 in the morning, at the beginning of what was clearly a pivoting moment, and have them tell you, cleanly, directly, without disguise, that they did not trust your judgment. He thought about whether he would have done the same thing. He thought about what he would have done 2 years ago if a senior partner had sent a halt order on a $250 million deal at 4 in the morning for reasons that appeared to be personal. Whether he would have made the call. He thought, probably yes. This was the thing that made it worse. The shelter is in Zone 7, he said, still looking at the window. That's accurate. Serena volunteers there. That's also accurate. He turned. What you didn't tell Yoon, what your accurate picture left out, is that the shelter has been operating for 11 years, that it serves 30 to 40 families on any given night, that the redevelopment of Zone 7 as currently planned displaces every one of them with no relocation provision in the project documents. Jin was looking at him steadily. That's a zoning compliance issue, not, there is no relocation provision, Jin. Min-jae came back to the desk. I pulled the full impact assessment last night. It's not there. Not in the original documents, not in the amended filings, not in the city application. It was either never drafted or it was removed. A pause. I want to know which. Something shifted in Jin's face. It was small, a very slight change in the set of his jaw, a quality of attention that was different from what had been there a moment before. Min-jae was watching for it, and he caught it. The city application was filed through the liaison's office, Jin said. Carefully now, choosing words with more care than he'd been choosing them before.
I know how it was filed. I want to know about the relocation provision.
That's a standard omission on development applications at this stage. It gets addressed in the Jin. Minjae kept his voice flat. Don't explain the process to me. I built the process. He put both hands on the desk again. Was the relocation provision drafted? A beat. A very specific beat. The beat of a man deciding whether to tell the truth. It was drafted, Jin said, early in the application process. It was removed before the final filing. Who removed it? It was a joint decision. The partners felt that including a relocation provision would complicate the permit timeline. The city liaison agreed. Jin's voice was controlled, but there was something working underneath the control now, something that had the texture of justification building its own case. The families in Zone 7 were going to receive standard displacement notices under city ordinance. That's the legal requirement. That's what was always planned. Standard displacement notices. Minjae said it slowly. Let each word sit separately. 30 families, elderly residents, people who have been in that neighborhood for 20 years, some of them. You were going to send them a letter. That's a letter that says your building is coming down in 90 days, and here's a list of city housing resources. He looked at Jin. That was the plan. That's standard? I know it's standard. The words came out hard now, harder than he'd intended, and he let them. I've been standard for 19 years. I know what standard looks like in practice. I know what those city housing resource lists look like. He stepped back. I need the full documentation, the original relocation provision, the decision record for its removal, every communication between your office and the liaison on this. A beat. Today, Jin looked at him. The calculation behind his eyes had been replaced by something else, something that was still careful, but had a different quality, a kind of wariness that was new. You're not reviewing the timeline, Jin said. You're building a case. I'm doing my job. You're building a case against the project. Jin stood now, and it had the quality of a man deciding he was no longer going to have this conversation from a seated position. Against a decision-making process that you approved, that you signed off on, that you were in the room for. His voice had an edge now that it hadn't had before, the edge of a man whose careful exterior was under pressure. If you go back through those documents with the intent to what? Minjae looked at him straight. Fix what was done wrong. To dismantle a $240 million deal because your wife volunteers at a building in the demolition zone. Jin's voice came out stripped of its care, direct now, the words arriving at their actual meaning without the wrapping of professional language. That's what this is. That's what you're doing. And I need you to hear me when I say that the organization cannot absorb. The organization, Minjae cut across him, quiet and precise, with the quality of someone making a final cut, rather than a contested one. The organization is mine, Jin. Every dollar of it, every relationship, every contact and contract and permit and city official and partner, it runs through me, not through you. He picked up his hands from the desk for the last time. Get me the documentation, today. He walked out. He was in the elevator before he felt the shake in his hands. He looked at them. The large hands, the thick fingers, and he pressed them flat against his thighs and breathed through it. The elevator descended. He breathed. By the ground floor, the hands were steady. He got in the Civic and sat. He pulled out his phone and called Dae-sung. The relocation provision, he said, when Dae-sung answered, for Zone 7. I need to know when it was removed, who made the call, and whether it was flagged to me at any point. Dae-sung was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll look. How long? An hour, maybe 2. Call me. He hung up. He sat in the car and thought about 30 families receiving a letter. He thought about the old man in the coat and what standard displacement looked like in practice for a man in his 70s with no resources and a dignified way of eating soup. He thought about what it meant that a provision designed to protect those people had been drafted and then removed because it complicated a permit timeline, and that this removal had been a joint decision, which meant it had been discussed, which meant multiple people in a room had looked at the mechanism designed to protect those families and decided that the protection was less important than the schedule. He thought about whether he would have been in that room. He thought about the documents he had signed. At 11:47 a.m., Dae-sung called back. The provision was in the original draft, Dae-sung said. His voice had the flat tone he used for information he was delivering without editorializing. It was flagged for removal in a meeting on February 14th of last year. The decision record lists 3 attendees, Jin, the city liaison, and a pause. Short, controlled. And you. Min-jae felt the cold go somewhere it had never been before. February 14th, he said. Yes. Last year. Yes. He pulled up his calendar archive with his free hand. February 14th, last year. He scrolled to it. He had had 4 meetings that day. He remembered 3 of them. The 4th was a 90-minute block listed as ECCP Phase 2 review with 3 attendees, but Jin, the liaison, and himself, with a note that said Permit Timeline Optimization and a notation that said Signed. He remembered that meeting. He remembered it as a routine review, a Phase 2 check-in on the permitting process. Jin had walked through a series of documents and Min-jae had signed a package at the end. He'd signed packages at the end of that kind of meeting dozens of times, the approval of technical processes that he delegated to Jin because the granular mechanics of permit applications were Jin's domain and there was no operational reason for Min-jae to read every page. He remembered not reading every page. He remembered signing. What did I sign? He said. The permit optimization package, Dae-sung said, which included a schedule of items flagged for removal from the application to streamline the city review process. A pause. The relocation provision was item 7 on that schedule. Min-jae sat with this. Item 7, on a schedule, of a package, that he had signed without reading in a 90-minute meeting on February 14th of last year, 14 months ago, before Serena had started volunteering at the shelter, before he'd ever walked down that street, before any of this had a face. He had signed the removal of the protection. He had done it himself. He sat in the gray Civic in the parking lot of his own building and felt something he had not felt in a very long time and almost didn't recognize. The specific, nauseating weight of being responsible for a harm you cannot claim you didn't know about. Because the not knowing was itself a choice, a series of choices. 19 years of choices about which pages you read and which ones you trusted to other people and what that trust was built on and what it cost. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from a number he didn't recognize. No name, no preamble, just an address in the Beacon Hill neighborhood and a time 2 p.m. today. He stared at the message. Then, below it, a second message from the same number. Come alone. I have something you need to see before Yoon Group's meeting tomorrow. He looked at the address. He ran it through the mental geography he kept of the city. Residential, south-facing slope. A neighborhood that was in the early stages of the same kind of transition that had been eating the East Side corridor. Old houses on large lots going one by one to developers. He didn't know the address. He typed back, "Who is this?" The response came in 40 seconds. Someone who worked on the Zone 7 application, before I didn't anymore. Min-jae looked at the message for a long time. Then he looked at the time. 12:03 p.m. He started the engine. The house in Beacon Hill was a craftsman bungalow, dark green, with a porch that had seen better decades, and a garden that was overgrown in the specific way of a garden that had once been tended by someone who no longer had the capacity to tend it. Min-jae parked on the street and sat for 3 minutes, running the visual perimeter. No unfamiliar vehicles, no visible positions, nothing that triggered the particular low-frequency alarm that 19 years of operating at his level had installed somewhere below conscious thought. He got out. He knocked. The woman who answered the door was in her mid-40s, compact, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the kind of exhaustion in her face that was not today's exhaustion, but had been accumulating for a long time. She was wearing the clothes of someone who used to dress professionally and had stopped. There was a cardboard box on the table behind her, half filled with documents. "Mr. Kang," she said. "You have something for me," he said. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. Her name was Clara Merritt. She had worked as a permit compliance analyst for the City Liaison's office for 9 years, with a subspecialty in community impact assessments for large-scale developments. She had been involved in the Zone 7 application from its earliest stages. She had drafted the original relocation provision. She had been let go from the liaison's office 11 months ago. Restructuring, she said. She was standing at the table with the cardboard box between them, and she said the word with the particular flatness of someone who knew what the word meant and what it was hiding. That's what they called it. 3 people in our department. All of us had raised questions about the Zone 7 impact documentation at various points. She paused. The timing was what it was. Min-jae looked at the box. What's in there? He said.
Copies, she said. I made them before I left. I knew. She stopped, adjusted the glasses on her head in a nervous gesture she probably didn't know she was making. I knew that what they were doing was wrong. I documented it. I kept copies. Another pause. I've been sitting on these for 11 months because I didn't know what to do with them, and I was scared. And then yesterday someone told me you'd halted Zone 7, and I thought, who told you? She hesitated.
Clara. He kept his voice level. Who told you I'd halted Zone 7? One of the other volunteers, she said quietly. At the shelter. I volunteer there sometimes. One of the other regulars heard something and told a few people, and it... She stopped. I know your wife volunteers there. That's how I got your number. The shelter. The information had moved through the shelter's network. The community of people connected to that basement. The informal network of people who cared about a building that Min-jae had been planning to demolish, and had reached this woman with a box of documents on a table in a house in Beacon Hill. He looked at the box. Show me, he said. She opened it, and what was inside took him 40 minutes to read through, standing at the table, and by the end of it, the cold that had been present since that morning had been replaced by something different, something that was not cold at all, something that had heat in it, a specific kind of heat that he recognized as the feeling of seeing a complete picture for the first time and understanding exactly how each piece had arrived at its current position. The relocation provision had not simply been removed for scheduling convenience. It had been removed because 3 of the 4 downstream partners waiting on Zone 7 clearance had purchased options on relocation housing in the same corridor. Options that would be worthless if the displaced families were given proper relocation assistance and could actually choose where to go. The relocation provision, properly implemented, would have directed those families to below-market housing options outside the partner's portfolio. Without it, they would have to find housing on the open market in a corridor where the partners controlled a significant percentage of the available inventory. The displacement of 30 families was not a side effect of the development. It was a revenue stream. Min-jae set down the last page. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at Clara Merritt, who was watching him with the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down and is not yet sure if they've set it in the right place. Jin knew this, he said. It was not a question. The relocation housing options were part of a package presented at the February 14th meeting, she said. The removal of the provision and the options acquisition were discussed together. She paused. As a coordinated strategy. February 14th, the meeting he'd attended, the package he'd signed. Had Jin known, when he put that package in front of Min-jae, that Min-jae wouldn't read every page? Had he constructed the presentation knowing that the provisions removal would be buried in a schedule of technical items, knowing that Min-jae trusted him with the mechanics? He thought about Jin's face that morning, the careful precision of it, the way he'd said, I didn't trust that you'd make the right call, and realized now that this was not a man expressing doubt about Min-jae's judgment in a moment of crisis. This was a man who had been making calls around Min-jae for a long time, and who, this morning, when the halt order arrived and the structure he'd built was suddenly at risk, had made the biggest one. Min-jae looked at the box of documents. He thought about the old man eating with dignity. The children. Serena's face behind the kitchen pass-through, laughing, the sleeves pushed up. He thought about what his signature meant on a document he hadn't read. He thought about Yoon Group's meeting tomorrow. He picked up the box. I need these, he said. Clara Merritt looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. I made 2 copies, she said. Keep them. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. The families in Zone 7, he said without turning, the ones who would have received displacement notices. A pause. Do you know how many of them are currently in the relocation housing options the partners acquired? Behind him, the silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. 17 of 32 households, she said. They were moved into the partners' portfolio properties during the pre-development phase. Their leases expire in February, 1 month before the demolition date.
Min-jae stood in the doorway with the box under his arm and felt the full weight of it arrive. Not in pieces, not distributed across the shock of discovery and the cold of calculation, but all at once, the complete shape of what had been built and what his name was on, and what it was going to take to undo it. He walked to the Civic. He put the box on the passenger seat. He sat for 30 seconds with both hands on the steering wheel, feeling the grain of it under his palms, and then he started the engine and he drove. He called Dae-sung from the road. "I need an emergency counsel," he said. "Everyone, 9th floor, 4 p.m. Dae-sung was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, the 2 seconds of a man doing rapid triage. "Jin too?" "Everyone means everyone." "Min-jae, 4 p.m. He hung up. He drove with the box on the seat beside him, and the city moving past the windows in the gray afternoon light, and he let his mind do what it did best. Not feel, not react, but map. Build the picture from every angle. Identify the load-bearing structures. Find the sequence that collapsed everything cleanly. Jin had been running a secondary architecture inside the organization. Not against it. That was the sophistication of it, the thing that made it both effective and difficult to confront. He hadn't been stealing or defecting. He had been steering. Building relationships with the downstream partners that ran parallel to Min-jae's relationships, cultivating Yoon Group's trust at a personal level, constructing the financial logic of the East Side Corridor in a way that served the partners' interests and Jin's position within those interests, and doing all of it in the space that Min-jae had created by trusting him with the mechanics. The signed package on February 14th was the masterpiece of it. Jin had put the removal of the relocation provision in front of Min-jae at a meeting framed as routine, in a document formatted to be signed without granular review, and Min-jae had signed it. If anything ever came apart, if the displaced families organized, if a journalist pulled the permit records, if a compliance analyst kept copies and found someone to give them to, Min-jae's signature was on the decision. Jin was protected, the partners were protected, and Min-jae was the man who had signed away 30 families' protection for a development deal. He thought about whether Jin had planned for this specific moment, whether, when he'd constructed that February 14th package, he'd understood that someday there might be a halt order, a confrontation, a moment when the full picture needed to be presented to someone, and that when that moment came, the picture would show Kang Min-jae's name on the wrong thing. He thought, probably yes. He thought, 16 years, and he had not seen it. He drove. The 9th floor at 4 p.m. had a different quality than it had at 6 a.m. At 6 a.m., it had been the calculated early morning pressure of men who'd had time to prepare. At 4 p.m., it was the accumulated tension of a full day of managed uncertainty arriving at a table simultaneously. Park Hyun-woo was there, the mild uncrossed ankle posture replaced by something more upright, Dae-sung by the window, standing, not performing relaxation. Two other senior figures, Lim Tae-jun, who handled the organization's cash operations, and Woo Byung-chul, the street-level liaison who managed the network's direct enforcement presence. A quiet man, heavy in the shoulders, whose presence in a room always meant that Min-jae was treating a situation as potentially physical. And Jin. Jin was seated at the far end of the table, and Min-jae noted that he had chosen a seat rather than a standing position, which meant he had decided to present as composed rather than reactive, which meant he'd been thinking since this morning about how this room was going to go and had made choices about how to inhabit it. Min-jae set the box on the table. He didn't sit. "Zone 7, he said. "The East Side Corridor. I'm going to tell you what I've found, and then I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, and then you're going to have time to ask questions." He looked around the table. "Not the other way." No one spoke. He went through it in 12 minutes. He was precise. He used the documents from the box, held them up, named them, set them down. He did not editorialize. He presented the sequence, the relocation provision, its removal, the coordinated strategy, the downstream partners' housing options, the 17 households already moved into those properties, the leases expiring in February. He laid it on the table the way you laid evidence on a table, without inflection, without heat, letting the shape of it speak. When he finished, the room was quiet. Park Hyun-woo was looking at the table. Lim Tae-jun had both hands flat on his thighs. Woo Byung-chul was looking at Jin with the focused, uncomplicated attention of a man whose job was reading people for what they were about to do. Jin was looking at Min-jae. "You went to see Merritt," Jin said. "She came to me."
Through the shelter network.
Something moved in Jin's face, not surprise, but a recalibration, the expression of a man adjusting his model of how things had developed. "I should have anticipated that." "Yes," Min-jae said. "You should have." Jin looked at the box, then back at Min-jae. "What do you want?" "I want to know how much of this was yours and how much was the partner's." "It was collaborative." "That's not an answer." "It's the accurate one." Jin's voice was controlled, the earlier edge present, but compressed now, running underneath the surface rather than at it. "The strategy emerged from conversations between my office and the partner's development teams over the course of 18 months. The relocation provision removal was proposed by the Yoon Group advisory team as a condition of their capital commitment at the current level. I brought it to the February meeting because I believed— You believed I'd sign it without reading it." Jin looked at him. "I believed it was within the scope of permit optimization decisions that you delegated to my office," Jin said, each word placed carefully, the placement itself a kind of argument. "I believed it was standard practice. I believed that the displacement of residents in a redevelopment zone was a city ordinance-level obligation and not—" "You believed I wouldn't care," Min-jae said. The room was very still. "Yes," Jin said, quiet, stripped of the careful placement. "I believed you wouldn't care." The honesty of it landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Dae-sung, by the window, did not move. Park Hyun-woo was looking at Jin now with the expression of a man recalibrating his own position relative to what was happening. Min-jae looked at Jin for a long moment. "You were right," he said. Jin blinked. 14 months ago, you were right." Min-jae kept his voice level, and it cost him something to keep it level, and he let it cost him. "I signed that package. I was in that meeting, and I signed it, and I didn't read it, and if you'd asked me that day what was in it, I couldn't have told you." He picked up the February 14th decision record from the table and set it back down. "So I'm not standing here to tell you that you were wrong about who I was." A pause. "I'm standing here because of who I'm not anymore." The room absorbed this. Jin's face had gone through several small adjustments and arrived at an expression that Min-jae had never seen on it before. Not quite uncertainty, not quite respect, something in the neighborhood of both. "The meeting with Yoon Group is tomorrow afternoon," Min-jae said. He addressed the table now, not just Jin. "I'll be going with a different proposal, not a 2-week review." He reached into the box and removed a document, 3 pages, printed this morning from his home system, drafted between 4 and 5 a.m. in a version that was now outdated and would need to be replaced with something that incorporated what he'd learned from Merritt. A full restructure of the Zone 7 acquisition. The shelter stays. The surrounding blocks proceed on a modified footprint. The 17 households in the partners' properties get legitimate lease extensions and relocation assistance funded by the development budget. He set the pages on the table. The project loses approximately $40 million in projected returns. It is still profitable. "Migun," Park Hyun-woo said very quietly. "Yoon Group is not going to accept that." "Yoon Group," Min-jae said, "is going to be presented with a choice. Accept the restructure and a profitable project with a longer timeline, or I bring the compliance documents to the city's development review board." He looked around the table. "The documents that show a coordinated strategy to remove displacement protections as part of a scheme to profit from those displacements. Documents with the signatures of their advisory team, their partner representatives, and their liaison contacts." A pause. "As well as mine." The air in the room changed. Lim Tae-jun looked up. "You'd expose your own signature." "Yes." "That opens you to—" "Yes." Min-jae looked at him directly. "I know what it opens me to." He let that sit. "I also know that what it opens Yoon Group to is considerably more visible, considerably more public, and considerably more difficult to manage than what it opens me to." They are a publicly adjacent organization with institutional investors and a board. I am not. He picked up the box. They will do the math. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Woo Byung-chul, who had said nothing since the meeting began, spoke in his quiet, heavy way. And Jin. Everyone looked at Min-jae. Min-jae looked at Jin. Jin was looking back at him with the careful, stripped expression of a man who had made his move and watched it develop into a shape he hadn't fully anticipated, and who was now doing, in real time, the same mapping that Min-jae had been doing all day, running the geometry, finding the walls. Jin is going to spend the next 18 months personally managing the relocation process for the Zone 7 families, Min-jae said. He is going to ensure that every household currently in a partner's property receives a legitimate lease extension, market rate relocation assistance, and first right of refusal on any below-market units in the development's final footprint. He kept his eyes on Jin. He is going to do this because it is the appropriate consequence for the decision he made, and because he is better positioned than anyone in this room to navigate the partner's resistance to it. A pause. And because the alternative is that I hand his name on those documents to people who will do something with it that neither of us wants. Jin held his gaze for a long time. Then he said, "That's not a consequence. That's a leash." "Yes," Min-jae said. "It is." Another silence. Jin looked at the table, at the documents, at the box. He looked at his hands briefly and then back at Min-jae, and in the look there was something that was not defeat exactly. Jin was not a man who did defeat in any clean or visible way, but was the particular expression of a man recalibrating the terms on which he was going to continue existing in his current position. "All right," Jin said. Min-jae nodded once. He looked at the table, at Park, at Lim, at Woo, at Dae-sung by the window, and he let the silence do its work for another moment. "Tomorrow's meeting is at 2 p.m., he said. "Dae-sung, I need the full financial model for the modified footprint by 9 a.m. Park. I need the downstream partners' exposure breakdown, not the summary, the actual numbers." "Woo." He looked at Byung-chul. "I need 2 people outside the Yoon Group building during the meeting, not inside, outside." Woo nodded. "We're done," Min-jae said. He picked up the box and walked out. He was in the elevator when Dae-sung caught up with him. He stepped in before the doors closed, and they rode down in silence for 3 floors before Dae-sung spoke. "You're going to war with Yoon Group," Dae-sung said. "I'm going to a meeting." Min-jae. He looked at Dae-sung, at the gray temples, the composed face, the 17 years of it behind the eyes. "Say what you're going to say." "Yoon Group is not going to be leveraged." Dae-sung's voice was even and serious, and without the careful diplomatic softening he usually applied to difficult things. "Not like this. Not with a compliance threat from a man whose signature is on the same documents. They have lawyers, and they have time, and they have money, and if they decide that fighting is cheaper than accepting your restructure, they will fight." He paused. "And they will use your signature." "I know. So you're prepared for what comes after that." The elevator opened on the ground floor. Min-jae stepped out. Dae-sung stepped out beside him. "I'm prepared for what comes after," Min-jae said. "Your daughter." "Is why I'm doing this," Min-jae said. It came out harder than he intended, and he didn't soften it. "She's due in March. The demolition was March 14th. I spent last night reading about what it means for a family to be displaced in 90 days with a letter and a list." He looked at Dae-sung. "I know what's at stake. I've known since 4 this morning." He paused. "I just didn't know my own name was going to be on the wrong side of it." Dae-sung looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "She knows. Serena. Does she know what tomorrow's meeting is going to be?" Min-jae thought about it. He thought about the kitchen this morning and the thermos on the counter and the way she'd said be careful without asking him to be anything other than what he was. "She knows enough," he said. Dae-sung nodded. Then, "I'll have the model by 9. He walked back to the elevator. Min-jae walked to the Civic. He drove to the shelter. It was 6:20 p.m. He parked across the street and he sat for a moment, and then he got out and he went in the main entrance instead of the stairwell. And the young man at the intake table, different from the last time, older, with a beard and reading glasses,
looked up with the same non-judgmental assessment. Volunteer or guest? Neither, Min-jae said. I need 5 minutes with whoever manages operations. The young man looked at him, looked at the box under his arm, made a decision. Hang on. The woman who came upstairs 3 minutes later was one of the 2 kitchen staff he'd seen Serena working alongside. Mid-50s, sturdy, wearing an apron that said East Side Community Table in the same hand-lettered style as the sign outside. She looked at Min-jae with the frank, evaluating gaze of someone who managed a resource-constrained operation and had no time for anything that wasn't directly useful. You're Serena's husband, she said. Yes. She's not here tonight. I know, I'm not here for her. He held out the box. I'm here for this. She looked at it, looked at him. What is it? Documentation of the Zone 7 acquisition strategy. Original filings, removed protections, the relocation housing scheme. Everything you'd need to make a complaint to the City Development Review Board, contact a journalist, or bring a legal challenge. He paused. I'm giving you the originals. I have copies. What you do with them is your decision. She looked at the box for a long moment. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, the way people looked when they were trying to take the full measure of something and weren't sure the measurement was going to come out in a direction they trusted. Why? She said. He thought about how to answer that. He thought about several versions of the answer and discarded them. The versions that were honest but strategic. The versions that were clean but incomplete. Because I signed documents I didn't read, he said, and the people in that basement paid for it. He paused. And I need you to have these regardless of what happens tomorrow, in case tomorrow doesn't go the way I need it to. She took the box. She didn't thank him. She looked at him with the frank gaze for another moment, and then she said, Your wife has been carrying this shelter for 4 years. You know that, right? Not just volunteering, carrying it. I'm starting to understand that, he said. She nodded once, the nod of a woman filing information in a place she'd use it later. He went back to the car. Serena was asleep when he got home. He stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at her, the hand under the cheek, the thermos on the nightstand. And he stood there for a moment in the dark, feeling the full weight of the day settle into his body. The hands, the shoulders, the back of the neck where tension lived when he was running at this level. He was tired in a way that went past physical, the kind of tired that comes from spending a day finding out who you've been. He didn't wake her. He went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and didn't make coffee. He stood in the dark with the city outside the windows, and he thought about tomorrow. Yoon Group's offices were in a tower in Belltown, 12 floors up, with a conference room that looked out over the water. He'd been in that room twice. He knew the table, knew the sight lines, knew how Director Yoon liked to position himself relative to the door, always with his back to the window, the light behind him, a positioning choice that Min-jae had always respected as deliberate. Tomorrow, he would walk into that room with the modified proposal and the compliance documents and the knowledge that his own signature was on the wrong pages, and he would present Yoon Group with a choice that they were not going to like and that he was not going to walk back from, and it was going to go one of 2 ways. He ran both ways in his mind. He ran them carefully, without sentiment, the way he ran scenarios, dispassionately, mapping the consequences of each branch, identifying the points at which the situation became unrecoverable and planning how to stay back from those points. He thought about Dae-sung's warning. They have lawyers and time and money. Yes, they did. He thought about what it would mean if Yoon Group fought. The compliance threat cut both ways. He knew that, had known it when he said it in the conference room. Using his own signature as leverage meant accepting that the signature existed, that it was on the record, that in the event of a public dispute, it would be visible. He had spent 19 years building an organization that existed in the space between visibility and invisibility. And a public compliance dispute with a major development group was the kind of thing that moved things toward the visible. He thought about his daughter. He thought about March 9th. He thought about the old man in the coat and the boy with the rolls and 32 households, and 17 of them already moved into the partner's portfolio waiting for February lease expirations like... His phone buzzed. He picked it up. Unknown number. Not the same one as Merritt's, though different exchange, different format. He answered. Min-jae. The voice was male, younger than he expected, slightly tight,
the tightness of someone making a call they'd been working up to. My name is Daniel Park. I'm Director Yoon's grandson. A pause. I'm on the advisory team. I was in the February 14th meeting. Min Jae was very still. I heard you're coming in tomorrow, Daniel Park said, with the merit documents. How did you hear that? Jin called my uncle this afternoon. A breath on the line. I need to talk to you before tomorrow. Not for the family, for me. Another pause, shorter, with something working in it. I'm the one who proposed the relocation provision removal. At the February meeting, it was my recommendation. The voice was getting tighter, more compressed, like something being held under pressure. I was 26. I wanted to close the deal. I didn't think about... He stopped. Min Jae waited. I've been thinking about it for 14 months, Daniel Park said. I need you to know that before you walk into that room tomorrow, and my grandfather... He stopped again. I need you to know there's at least one person on that side of the table who thinks you're right. The line was quiet. Min Jae looked at the dark city outside the windows. Come to the meeting, he said. Be in the room. My grandfather... Be in the room, Min Jae said. That's all. He hung up. He stood in the dark kitchen for a long time. Then he went to the bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed without waking Serena. He looked at the thermos on the nightstand, the dented blue of it, the worn grip, the ghost outlines of stickers removed with careful patience. And he felt the full strange weight of the night pressing down, the accumulated consequence of 19 years arriving at this particular Tuesday in October, at this particular bedside, at this particular object. He lay down. He did not sleep for a long time. When it came, at somewhere past 2, it came suddenly, the way sleep sometimes does after the body has exhausted its capacity to remain in a state of tension, dropping into it without warning, leaving behind, for just a moment before the dark took over completely, the image of Serena at the shelter kitchen window, laughing, with her sleeves pushed up, radiant in the specific way of being exactly where she wanted to be. The Yoon Group conference room was exactly as he remembered it. Director Yoon at the head of the table, back to the window, the water gray behind him. 2 attorneys on his left. The representative, a smooth man in his 40s named Stephen Lim, who Min Jae had dealt with 4 times and who was excellent at expressing concern while communicating threat, on his right. And at the far end, slightly back from the table, as if positioned to observe rather than participate, Daniel Park. 27 or 28, with his grandfather's composed face and something else in his eyes that the older man didn't have. Something that was the specific quality of someone who had been carrying a thing for 14 months and had made a decision about it the night before. Min Jae sat across from Director Yoon. He put the documents on the table. Before we begin, Director Yoon said, in the measured, paternal tone of a man who intended to control the pace of the room, I want to be clear about our position. The East Side Corridor timeline, the relocation provision, Min Jae said. The director paused. The original relocation provision drafted for the Zone 7 application, Min Jae said, was removed from the permit filing at the February 14th meeting on a recommendation brought by your advisory team as a condition of maintaining the current capital commitment level. He set the first document on the table and slid it toward the center. The removal was coordinated with the simultaneous acquisition of relocation housing options by the downstream partners, creating a financial incentive for displacement that was not disclosed in the permit application. He set the second document. 17 of 32 households in the zone have already been moved into those partner-controlled properties during the pre-development phase. Their leases expire in February. Third document. 1 month before demolition. The room was very quiet. Director Yoon looked at the documents. He did not reach for them. He looked at them the way a man looked at something he recognized from a distance, with the particular quality of seeing something that he had known was going to arrive eventually and had been calculating the cost of. Stephen Lim said, these documents were obtained through a former city compliance analyst who retained copies before being let go from the liaison's office, Min Jae said, 11 months ago, in a round of restructuring that included 3 analysts who had raised questions about Zone 7 impact documentation. He paused. The timing is documented.
Another silence. One of the attorneys leaned toward Director Yoon and said something very quietly. The director did not look at him. He was looking at Min Jae. "What do you want?" Director Yoon said. The paternal tone was gone. This was the other voice. The one that had built a group worth billions. The voice that had learned to ask the question that ended the preamble. Min Jae opened his mouth to answer, and that was when the door opened. Not the main door, the side door. The one that connected the conference room to the building's internal corridor that Min Jae had clocked on his first visit to this room 12 years ago as a secondary exit and had never seen used in any of his subsequent visits because it was always locked from the other side. It was not locked now. Dae-sung came through it. Min Jae looked at him. Dae-sung's face had the specific quality that Min Jae had seen perhaps 4 times in 17 years. The controlled, compressed quality of a man delivering information that has no good version. "I need 30 seconds, Dae-sung said. Director Yoon looked at him with the expression of a man deeply accustomed to not being interrupted. 30 seconds, Dae-sung said again, and his eyes were on Min Jae, and only on Min Jae, and the quality in them was the quality of something urgent arriving at the worst possible time. Min Jae stood. "Excuse me," he said to Director Yoon, in a tone that did not ask permission, and he walked to the side of the room where Dae-sung was standing, and Dae-sung turned and Min Jae followed him into the internal corridor, and the door closed behind them. The corridor was narrow and fluorescent and empty. Dae-sung turned to face him, and his expression had the quality that Min Jae had been reading for 17 years. The expression of a man who had already done the math and didn't like the answer. "Serena," Dae-sung said. "She called me 20 minutes ago because you weren't picking up." He paused. "She's at the hospital. It started this morning. She didn't want to interrupt the meeting, but—" Min Jae was already moving. He went back through the door. He picked up the documents from the conference table in a single motion, not sorting them, not organizing them, just gathering them against his chest. He looked at Director Yoon. "My wife is in labor," he said. 7 weeks early. The room was very still. "We'll continue this," Min Jae said, "when I know my daughter is safe." He looked at Daniel Park, briefly, at the young man's face, which had gone through something complicated in the last 30 seconds and arrived at something clear, and then he walked out. Dae-sung was already in the elevator. Swedish Medical Center was 12 minutes from Belltown in afternoon traffic. Min Jae made it in 9. He was out of the car before it fully stopped in the drop-off lane, and he was through the automatic doors and at the desk, and then moving through the corridors with the particular focused speed of a man who had been operating at a high level all day and had just had everything stripped away except the one thing that actually mattered. Serena was in a room on the 4th floor. She was in the bed with monitors attached and an IV in her left arm, and she looked, when he came through the door, both worse and better than he was prepared for. Worse, because she was clearly in pain, the controlled, managed pain of someone working through contractions with the particular compressed focus that he recognized as her version of handling something that was bigger than she wanted it to be. And better, because she was awake and oriented, and she looked at him when he came in with the full attention she gave things that mattered. "You came," she said. "Of course I came." He crossed to the bed. He took her hand, the right one, not the one with the IV, and held it with both of his and felt the grip she returned, which was stronger than he expected and told him something about the level of pain she was not describing. "What happened?" "Contractions started around 10. I thought it would stop." Her voice was steady, but there was something working in it, something underneath the steadiness. "It didn't stop." 7 weeks early. "They said she's viable." Serena's voice was careful on the word, the careful of someone holding a word they needed to be true very steadily. "Her lungs are developed enough. They said the odds are—" She stopped, breathed through something. Her grip on his hands tightened and released. "They said the odds are good." "The odds are good," he said. "Don't just repeat it back." "I'm not." He looked at her directly. "She's yours. She's going to be fine." Serena looked at him for a moment, then she said, "How did the meeting go?" "Serena, tell me." He looked at her. At the monitors, the IV, the controlled pain in her face. He thought about the Zone 7 documents on the floor of the Yoon Group conference room where he'd left them. He thought about Director Yoon's face when he'd said, "My wife is in labor," and stood up. He thought about Daniel Park. "I'll tell you later," he said. "Min Jae, it went the way it needed to go," he said. "I'll tell you all of it, later." He tightened his hold on her hand. "Right now I'm here." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes had the quality they sometimes had, the full attention quality, the one that had once felt like a gift and had at some point, somewhere in the past 3 weeks, become something he understood as the rarest thing he'd ever been given. She was reading him the way she always read him, looking for the version underneath the version he presented. Whatever she found, she didn't argue with it. "Okay," she said. "Later." He sat in the chair beside her bed, and he held her hand, and he stayed. Their daughter was born at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. She weighed 4 pounds and 9 ounces. She had Serena's mouth and Min Jae's hands, already visible, even at that size, the breadth of the palm, the thickness of the fingers. And she came into the world making a sound that was small but definite, a sound that had in it the specific quality of something that intended to continue. They took her to the NICU, and Min Jae stood at the window and looked at her in the incubator. The tubes, the monitors, the miniature, fierce aliveness of her, and felt something move through him that he had no word for. Not the cold clarity he'd been operating in for 2 days, not the mapping and the geometry. Something older than all of that. Something that had been there before the organization, before the money, before the 19 years of choosing power, because it was the most reliable available protection against everything he'd been afraid of when he was young. He stood at the window for a long time. When he went back to Serena's room, she was awake, exhausted in the profound way that came after, lying with both hands flat on the blanket and her face open in a way he had never seen it, stripped of everything, the management and the careful attention and the weight of the things she'd been carrying, just her face, just Serena, looking at the ceiling. He sat beside her. "She's loud," he said. Serena's mouth moved. "Good. She has your mouth. Good." A pause. A breath. "Is she—" "She's strong," he said. "She's loud, and she's strong, and she looks furious about everything, which I think she gets from you." Serena made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then winced because laughing hurt. She turned her head to look at him. "Tell me," she said, "about the meeting." So he told her. He told her all of it. The documents from Merritt, the conference room, Jin's face when Min Jae said leash, the call from Daniel Park the night before. He told her about walking into Yoon Group's office with the compliance documents. He told her about Dae Sung coming through the side door. He told her that he'd left the documents on the table and walked out. She listened without interrupting. This was one of her things, the capacity to listen to a full thing before responding to any part of it. He had always found it slightly unnerving, the completeness of her attention without any of the interjections people usually use to signal that they were following. She just listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The documents are still on the table," she said. "Yes." "You don't know how Yoon Group is going to respond." "Not yet." She looked at the ceiling. "What do you think they'll do?" He thought about it honestly. "I think Director Yoon is going to have a conversation with his lawyers tonight. I think they're going to assess the exposure. I think they're going to conclude that fighting is possible but expensive and visible, and that the restructured deal, while less profitable, is cleaner." He paused. "I think Daniel Park is going to say something in that conversation that his grandfather doesn't fully expect." Another pause. "But I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And if they fight, then it gets harder and longer and more expensive." He looked at her directly. "And I still don't give them Zone 7 as it was." She looked at him. "It's going to cost you," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "How much?" "Enough." He held her gaze. "Not everything. Enough." She was quiet for a long moment. The monitors beeped softly. Somewhere down the hall, something beeped differently and someone responded to it with quiet footsteps and the particular composed efficiency of people who worked nights in a hospital. "I kept it from you for 2 months, Serena said. "The shelter, the zone, all of it." "Yes. I was wrong to do that." He looked at her. "You were scared. I was wrong, and I was scared." She turned her head to face him fully. "Both can be true." Her voice was tired, but it was honest and clear in the way that exhaustion sometimes cleared things, burning away the coating and leaving the actual surface. I was afraid of what you'd do with it, what you'd do with knowing where I came from. I didn't trust you with it. A pause. I should have. He thought about what to say. He thought about several versions of a response that were true, and some of them were forgiving and some of them were self-exculpating, and none of them were quite right. Then he said, I gave you reasons not to trust me. For years. She looked at him. The man who was in that meeting room in February, he said, signing packages without reading them, running an organization that displaced 30 families because the protection provision was inconvenient, that man gave you accurate information about what to expect. He paused. I can't be angry at you for reading me correctly. You've changed, she said. I'm changing, he said. The distinction felt important. I don't know how far it goes yet. I don't want to tell you I've become something until I know what I've become. He looked at her. But I know that whatever I was doing in that conference room today, leaving the documents on the table, walking out, I know that was right. I know it in a way I haven't known a business decision in a long time. She reached out and found his hand on the armrest of the chair. She held it. Our daughter is in there, she said, meaning the NICU down the hall. She's 7 weeks early and she weighs 4.5 pounds and she's in an incubator. Yes. And you're here. Yes. She held his hand and looked at the ceiling and breathed. And he sat in the chair and held her hand, and they stayed like that for a long time without speaking, in the quiet of the room, in the soft, persistent beeping of the monitors, and the distant sounds of the hospital's night moving around them. And it was not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of something that had been through something and come out the other side into a space where the noise had stopped. 3 days later, Director Yoon called. Min-jae took the call in the hospital parking structure, standing beside the Civic in the gray concrete quiet, while Serena was upstairs with their daughter, who they were calling Hana, a name they'd agreed on months ago and which had somehow become more fitting in the days since she arrived, small and fierce and entirely herself. My grandson spoke to me, Director Yoon said. Min-jae waited. At length, the old man said. Something in his voice was different from the last call. The measured paternal authority was still there, but it was carrying something additional, something that had weight and texture and was not comfortable for the man carrying it. He told me what his recommendation was in February. He told me what he understood that recommendation to mean for the people in Zone 7 and what he understands it to have meant in practice. A pause. He is 27 years old, and he has been in this business for 3 years, and I have been in it for 50, and there are things I have forgotten how to see. Min-jae said nothing. The restructured proposal, Director Yoon said. Send it to my office. Not to Stephen Lim. To my office directly. A pause. I want to see the modified footprint. I want to see the relocation assistance framework. And I want Daniel involved in the implementation. Another pause, longer, with something working in it. He asked for that specifically. I'll send it today, Min-jae said. There will be significant pushback from the downstream partners, Yoon said. The partners whose options position depends on the displacement. I know. I will handle the conversation with those partners, Yoon said. It will be easier coming from me. Something that might have been in a different man, in a less composed voice, something like dry humor. I am harder to say no to. Yes, Min-jae said. You are. A silence. Your daughter, Yoon said. She's doing well. Good. The word was plain and meant as plain. That's good. A beat. Send the proposal today. He hung up. Min-jae stood in the parking structure for a moment, in the concrete silence, and felt the particular quality of something large and contested arriving at a resolution. Not triumphant, not clean, but real. The kind of resolution that cost something and kept costing and was worth it anyway. He went upstairs. Jin came to the hospital on the 4th day. Min-jae had not summoned him and had not expected him. He arrived in the late afternoon, stood in the doorway of Serena's room with his coat on and his hands in his pockets, and looked at the room. At Serena in the bed, at Min-jae in the chair, at the photograph on the nightstand that a nurse had taken of Hana in the incubator,
fierce and small and alive. I heard she's doing well, Jin said. She is, Min-jae said. Jin looked at the photograph for a moment. Then he looked at Min-jae. Yoon Group is accepting the restructure. I know. The downstream partners are going to take a significant loss on the options position. A pause. They're not pleased. They made a bet on other people's displacement, Min-jae said. The bet didn't pay. That's the business. Jin was quiet for a moment. He looked at Serena, who was watching him with the straight-on quality of her attention. I'm sorry, he said. He said it to her specifically, not to the room, not to Min-jae. For the Zone 7 strategy, for what would have happened to the shelter. A pause. For the families. Serena looked at him for a long time. Start the relocation work, she said. That's the apology. Jin looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not the calculating compression of the conference room, something less defended. The expression of a man being spoken to in a register he hadn't expected. He nodded once. He looked at Min-jae. The organization, he said. You know, things are going to be different now. The way we operate, the way we handle acquisitions. Yes, Min-jae said. They are. Jin absorbed this. He looked at the floor briefly, then back. I don't know if I can work inside that, he said. The honesty of it was the same honesty as the conference room. Direct, without cover. A different structure, different terms. I've been building this specific thing for 16 years. Min-jae looked at him. Then take the real estate arm, he said. Properly, not as a subdivision, your own structure, your own operation. The East Side Corridor as the foundational project, clean, restructured, with the relocation work as the first deliverable. He paused. We're not the same kind of operation anymore. We don't have to be the same organization. Jin was quiet for a long moment. That's generous, he said finally. The word came out slightly uncertain, as if he wasn't fully sure it was the right word, and was using it anyway. It's practical, Min-jae said. You built it. You know it better than anyone. And I need someone who knows the city's development infrastructure to make the restructured project work. He held Jin's gaze. The relocation work gets done. That's the condition. Everything else, we figure out. Another silence. Jin nodded. He looked at the photograph of Hana one more time. Then he left. Serena was watching Min-jae when he turned back to the room. You just let him go, she said. I just changed what he was building. Is that the same thing? He thought about it. I don't know yet, he said. Ask me in a year. She looked at him for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Hana came home in early December. Not March. Not the month of the demolished timeline. Not the month the demolition order had been scheduled to flatten a building and the 30 families who orbited it. She came home early, as she had arrived early, on her own schedule, in her own time, in a car seat that was slightly too large for her still small body, in which she occupied with the furious dignity of a person who had decided that the circumstances of her situation were no obstacle to her essential character. Min-jae drove, slowly, more slowly than he had driven anything in years, with both hands on the wheel and the particular focused care of someone transporting something irreplaceable. Serena sat in the back beside the car seat and kept one hand on Hana's chest through the whole drive home. Not anxiously, not protectively in the hovering way, just present, just the warm contact of a hand saying, I'm here, and you're here, and we're here together in the wordless language that bodies have been using longer than people have had words for anything. Min-jae watched them in the rearview mirror. He drove. The shelter was still standing in January. Min-jae walked through it for the first time in daylight, in the early afternoon, on a Tuesday when it was closed to guests. He walked through it with the shelter's operations manager, the woman with the apron who had taken the box of documents from him in October, whose name was Margaret, who had managed this place for 9 of its 11 years, and who showed him through it with the frank, unsentimental efficiency of someone who loved a thing too much to be precious about it. The basement was smaller than it felt at night. The kitchen was functional and old and had been repaired so many times that the repairs had their own repairs. The tables were mismatched in the way of things acquired gradually, by donation, by necessity. The walls had been painted over several times and showed the history of each coat and the places where the paint had chipped. Min-jae walked through it and saw what it was, what it actually was, in the daylight, without the ambient warmth of a room full of people, a building that was old and small and impractical and entirely essential. "What do you need?" he said. Margaret looked at him with the frank, evaluating gaze. "The kitchen equipment is at end of life. The HVAC hasn't been properly serviced in 4 years. The capacity is maxed. We turn people away twice a week because we don't have room." She paused. "What we need is a larger space. What we have is this space which we are keeping." "Both," Min-jae said. She looked at him. "Keep this building," he said. "It stays. The Zone 7 restructure keeps it in the footprint. It's in the documents. But the corridor project includes 3 adjacent properties on the block. One of them can be converted to a permanent community center." He paused. "Larger kitchen. More capacity. This building becomes the administrative base." He looked around the basement. "Nothing gets demolished." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She had the expression of someone doing a very careful calculation about whether to believe something. "This comes from the development budget?" she said. "From my organization's share of the development returns," he said, "which are reduced but present." A pause. "It's not charity, it's a use of capital that I'm choosing." She looked at him for another long moment. "Why?" she said. It was the same question she'd asked in October, outside the shelter, when he'd handed her the documents. He thought about the same answer he'd given then, "Because I signed documents I didn't read," and whether it was still sufficient, whether it was still the true center of it. He thought about Hana at 4 pounds and 9 ounces in an incubator. He thought about the boy with the 3 rolls. He thought about Serena at 8 years old in this neighborhood, in this city, carrying a thermos through winters that were too cold and too long. "Because it's right," he said. And then, because he was trying to be the person who said the true thing rather than the managed thing, and because it was wrong, before. And I knew what wrong looked like, and I let it happen anyway. He looked at the kitchen, at the repairs on the walls. "This is what I can do about that." Margaret looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "The HVAC first. It's the most urgent." "I'll have someone there this week," he said. She nodded. She was not effusive. She was not grateful in the performative way. She had the quality of a person who received practical commitments practically, who judged things by whether they materialized and not by the quality of the words around them. Min-jae respected this. Serena came back to the shelter in February. She came on a Tuesday evening with the thermos and the tote bag and the flat-soled boots, and Min-jae drove her. Not following her this time. Not the gray Civic and the 5-car-length distance and the stairwell in the dark. He drove her to the door and he parked and he came inside. He went to the serving line. Margaret handed him a ladle. He served soup for 2 hours. He was not good at it initially. He was too precise, portioning the bowls with the careful accuracy of someone accustomed to measuring things, and Margaret corrected him once, quietly. "More. Nobody comes here for precise portions." He adjusted. He learned the rhythm of it, the ladle, the eye contact, the small exchange of words that was not nothing and not everything, but was the specific thing that happened when you looked at a person who was hungry and you fed them and you let that be a complete transaction without making it about anything larger than itself. He served the boy in the overlarge sneakers, who had been joined by a younger sister since October. He gave her a roll before she asked. She looked at it with the same expression her brother had worn, the uncertain excess of receiving more than requested. And then she looked at Min-jae and said thank you, with the formal politeness of a child who had been taught that you said thank you, regardless of how tired you were, regardless of anything. "You're welcome," Min-jae said, and meant it. He found Serena at the end of the evening, in the kitchen, cleaning up. The sleeves pushed up, the thermos on the counter beside her moving through the end-of-night routine with the ease of someone who had done it hundreds of times. She glanced at him when he came through the kitchen door, glanced at the apron someone had given him, which said East Side Community Table in the same hand-lettered style as everything else here. Something crossed her face, something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, and not quite any single thing he had a clean name for. "How was it?" she said. He thought about the boy's sister and the roll. He thought about the old man who had been there tonight in the same coat with the same dignified precision. "Good," he said. She looked at him for a moment.
You have soup on your sleeve, she said. He looked. He did. A long dark drip down the left cuff of a shirt that had cost more than the shelter's weekly food budget. I know, he said. She turned back to the counter. She was smiling. Not the careful managed smile, but the one she saved for when she forgot to be careful. The one he had watched from a stairwell in October and not understood until now, standing in a kitchen with a ladle and soup on his sleeve, what it actually meant. He picked up a dish towel and started drying. They worked in the kitchen together until the lights went down in the dining room and the last guests had gone out into the cold night and Margaret had locked the side door and the building was quiet around them. Outside, the street was wet from a light rain that had started sometime in the last hour, the city glistening in the dark in the particular way of a city at night after rain. The lights fractured and multiplied in the puddles, the buildings reflected in the wet pavement, everything doubled and present and briefly, impermanently beautiful. Min-jae held the door for Serena. She stepped out. He followed. The car was across the street and she reached for his hand as they crossed. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just the automatic gesture of a woman who had reached for this particular hand in this particular dark enough times that it had become the default, the thing her hand knew to do without consulting the rest of her. He held it. They drove home. Hana was asleep when they came in the bassinet in the bedroom, with the small, fierce aliveness of her that Min-jae had not stopped marveling at, the way she occupied the space she was given with a totality that had nothing to do with size. He stood over her for a moment in the dark, looking at her hands, the breadth of the palm, the thickness of the fingers, already his hands, and what he was going to do with that fact, what kind of hands he was going to teach her those hands could be. He turned off the light. Serena was in the kitchen, filling the thermos at the sink, the water running, the kitchen lit with the warm setting on the overhead, the sound of the city outside the windows in the wet Tuesday night. He came to stand beside her. She finished filling the thermos and tightened the lid and set it on the counter. She looked at it for a moment. The dented blue of it, the worn grip, the ghost outlines of the stickers. Her mother's thermos, his wife's thermos, the thing that had traveled from a winter in this city 40 years ago through every version of Serena's life to this counter in this kitchen tonight. She looked up at him. Thank you, she said, quietly, without performing it. He looked at her. For what? For not making me explain why it matters. She paused. Most people, if you told them the whole story, the shelter, the winters, my mom, they'd make it into something, a thing they needed to respond to correctly. She looked at the thermos. You just showed up. He thought about everything he could say to that. He thought about February 14th and Zone 7 and signing packages he didn't read and standing in a stairwell in October watching his wife be the person she actually was. He thought about the 40 minutes in the parking structure and the phone call with Yoon and the soup on his sleeve. He thought about all of it, the full weight and shape of the past 4 months. He said, I'm still learning how. She looked at him. I know, she said. That's why I said thank you. She picked up the thermos and carried it to the entryway table, where she always left it, where he had looked at it every evening for 3 weeks without asking about it. And she set it down, and the small sound it made against the marble was the sound of something familiar arriving at its right place. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the city outside the windows. The rain still light, the light still doubled in the wet street. The port to the west, where his money moved, and the neighborhoods to the south and east, where the construction would begin in spring on something different, something that grew around people instead of through them. He thought about power, not the abstraction of it, not the word, but the actual texture of it, what it felt like in the hand, what it cost to carry, what it was actually for. He had spent 19 years understanding power as the capacity to make things happen, to move money and people and outcomes, to occupy the space where decisions were made. He still believed in that capacity. He was still, at his core, a man who moved through the world by understanding where the levers were. But he was beginning to understand that the question was never where the levers were. The question was always what you chose to move with them. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. And outside, the city continued its long, complicated, indifferent life. The rain falling on the port and the shelter and the construction sites and the streets where families were sleeping in apartments they would be able to keep, and somewhere in that city, in a building that was still standing, a hand-lettered sign read, East Side community table in faded paint that had been touched up recently in one corner, and the lights behind the plywood were dark for the night. And in the morning they would come back on, and the tables would be set, and the soup would go on the stove, and the door would open. The door would open. That was enough. That was at the end of all of it, exactly enough.